Really? That's what I was looking for. All right.
It hits the big red live on here.
Yeah. Let's see. Go here. But I don't want to get to play. Thank you. Okay. Tripp Fuller is now live. It's true. I am. But I need.
You're so meta.
Let me, yeah. Meta all up in the piece. Just
that's right.
Meta everywhere. Yes, I would like to mark that as an announcement. So it is at the top of the page. There you go. Perfect. All right.
And thank you so much for sending his regards. How wonderful. If you see him again, tell Andy hello. I hold him in very, very high regard. That's fantastic.
All right. So before we officially start, like, how are you doing, Aaron?
I'm doing good. I just got done, obviously, with family being here for Thanksgiving holiday last week. Mm-hmm. And that was a lot of fun. Ended up going mountain biking with my sister's partner 2 days in a row. He like runs enduro races and stuff. And so, you know, he definitely pushed me a little bit further than my ability levels were. And so we had an absolute ball and did a bunch of downhill together. And so, yeah, it was great. Boosters are wonderful, man. They facilitate getting back with people you love. And that's pretty cool.
Oh, okay. So someone said I'm ringing. Fred did. Take off the ring. You keep phasing in and out of existence.
It's the Lord of the Rings joke, bro. You're coming in and out because of the the background.
I thought I was thinking ring like there was audio ring, and I'm like, oh no, we just tested this because I got a new microphone, and then all of a sudden I got worried that which before it officially started, like a homebrewed member sent me a very nice microphone.
Wow.
And I mean, I assume it was an anonymous gift.
Oh my goodness, that's fantastic. You have to do like an unboxing video or something, man. That's fantastic. I admit my fancy
unboxed, Aaron.
Repackage it. My wife does this. She, in fact, will at the end of the day look at her to-do list and write stuff down and then cross it off immediately. It's like, ooh, I did this thing. So she gets to feel this great sense of accomplishment.
Oh, yeah. I understand that. Sometimes if I forget to make a to-do list, start to get overwhelmed and have already accomplished things, I go ahead and put things I've already done on the list. So that I'm like, oh, I'm already
look at how much I did. Someone said here that that you are going soft here. So
you thought I was loud earlier.
You're still loud on my end, but clearly not on
but
hers.
I'm just gonna turn it up.
That's cool. Now. I will drop me down.
No, you can stay.
I'm saying whatever. I'm dropping you down in my headphones.
Oh,
though my ears have rung from Gojira concerts, but never from talking to you.
I feel loud right now. So if I'm not adequately loud, someone should say something because it's better. Thank you, Linda. Excellent.
Absolutely.
All righty. Cool. Are you ready for me to hit record and stuff?
I'm rocking, man. Let's do
rocking.
This.
You're rocking.
Get the skills that pay the bills. Let's do it.
Hi, Michael, from Ottawa. He's on. We got people on YouTube and Facebook and on Zoom. So I'm watching the comments and things.
I am not, so I appreciate
you.
Do it. You filtering.
Stay focused. You have to stay focused, Aaron. I know, but now you're no longer the president of the Kierkegaard Society, right?
Well, I have to send a newsletter out this week, and as soon as I send that newsletter out, yes, I have either washed my hands or taken off the robe and crown or whatever the right metaphor would be. But
right,
yeah,
good. I'm
it's,
just glad you're still
you know,
official this week.
I still have a couple more days. We've got our election results in, which we'll be announcing via the newsletter. And I had to write a presidential sort of address for it. And so I've got that done and going to hopefully get it out in the next couple of days to everybody.
All right. There we go.
It's tasty. Tasty.
Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and I'm joined by Aaron Simmons for this fourth session of Walking with Kierkegaard. I am underneath my house in very surprisingly cold Scotland, full of rain, which is why I'm bundled up. And Aaron, how's life in South Carolina going?
Hey man, doing well. Fourth time's the charm, what I hear. I keep wanting to put on like my Carhartt toboggan just to keep up with you, but it would make me drip with sweat here in South Carolina. So I'm gonna have to let you go on.
Look, well, one of my friends started making these with the homebrewed monk on.
That is so
toboggan.
Cool.
And only certain parts of the country call these toboggans.
Huh.
Toboggan in Scotland is a sled.
Yeah. So toboggan or beanie is the I would refer to it either way, right?
Yeah, and some people call them toques.
I've never heard that.
When I hear toque, I think of the last name of a certain hobbit.
I'm immediately with you on that one. See, I think though what you need to do, Tripp, is start making a homebrewed beanie the thank you gift for people doing classes with you online. I think that needs to be sent around.
If you send me your address, I will gladly send you a toboggan. I emailed oops, sorry. I just hit my I hit the whoop.
Now you're entirely disappeared. You put that ring back on, man. You're poof.
See, I still on. I don't know what happened, but
Lord.
Yeah. Anyway,
this might get silly, my friend.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of extra cords, and also because of my new mic, and I think I just unplugged the camera. Well, if I disappear though, it's either that or ring action. So
great.
So before we jump in to really tackling, is this one? How would you power rank the Kierkegaard readings? Like, this one for me is the one I've read the most times. Had to write a comprehensive exam essay on it, and but I read it in undergrad and I've read it multiple times since then. So like when I started reading this, I just got happy.
That's how I feel when I read Walt Whitman. My plan then is for all the hard questions. I'll just say, didn't you write an exam on this Tripp? I'll let you handle this one. So please send in real tough ones tonight so I can bat them back to Dr. Fuller. So I would say that this is hands down the kind of play-by-play for anybody who is interested in reading Kierkegaard as an existentialist. This is the text to go to. So this is where we'll find early Heidegger in this text. We'll find some early Sartre in this text. There's really cool stuff. If you're a fan of people, even like, Poliani, and his relational knowing, that stuff's anchored here. There's Bonhoefferian, material that's already in play that comes up in his Act and Being. So basically this is the text where the existential Kierkegaard's kind of on the scene. But it's interesting. Heidegger said at one point that if you wanted the most philosophical Kierkegaard, you had to go to his discourses, which we're going to be doing the last 2 weeks. So our next two meetings might be the most philosophical precisely because they are Kierkegaard in his own voice doing Christian thinking. And Heidegger said that was where the fun really happens.
Well, I don't know. I think I always get excited once Lessing's Ditch is brought up. And I know there are a couple of questions about it, but we will get to the questions after you introduce things.
So is this though, the whole Jerry Maguire, you had me at hello? Did your wife, when y'all were dating, like make some Lessing's Ditch and you were like, you had me at Lessing's Ditch and that was it for y'all?
No, sadly it wasn't that cool. I will say that the first Christmas when we were dating, You know what she got me?
I do not.
The 3 different color cloth bound first editions of Paul Tillich's Systematic Theology.
Wow. So she knew you well right out of the gate.
And a signed Striper Bible.
Now,
the ones they used to throw out.
Now I'm impressed. I mean, Tillich Schmillich, but freaking Matthew Sweet. Heck yeah, man. Oh,
the Bible thumping bumblebees.
Woo,
all those
that's
yellow
fantastic.
and black spandex,
man.
Which every once in a while, I put some on. Don't quite rock it the same way they did.
I'm not sure I want to see that video. Yeah, my wife, for our 5th anniversary after being married, bought me the multi-volume hardback bound set of Calvin and Hobbes. Oh. So, I'll take that over Tillich any day.
I don't know. I love Paul Tillich. I want to do a class on Paul Tillich. But what's funny, every time I get excited about any philosopher or theologian, I'm like, man, do I have a friend that's a specialist in this? I'd love to do a class. Give me a reason to talk to him about it.
If you want to talk about Paul Tillich, right? Go, John Tatamano is a good buddy of mine, and that boy is doing some really cool stuff with Tillich.
I know. I'm
a big fan of his.
John's been on the podcast a few times. I keep hitting at him, going like,
you just have to show him your yellow and black spandex.
That's what it is.
He will come all in, man.
Wow,
that's been the secret.
Yeah. Well, I want you to know that I've never had someone join me in a small excursus of an introduction quite like you, Aaron. I really appreciate it. We're gonna let you my best. Take over and introduce things. And I want to tell everyone, Aaron has a small task. In this past week, I got stacks of comments that said 2 things. Hard to do them both at the same time. Hey, Tripp, could you spend more time talking about the text specifically and get a little more nerdy? Tell us all the background and all the philosophers he's talking about and blah, 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 blah. And then people are like, whoa, that felt like grad school. Could we dial it back a little bit? So I'm like, I'm glad Aaron is going to open things up because it's his last week as president of the Kierkegaard Society.
Once you step down, all of the knowledge goes away. Yeah, so next week's going to be bonkers, man.
Yeah, next week.
Works of what now was it, Tripp? Works of Blove, was it?
Yeah. So what we're going to attempt to do, we'll have an introduction. Then I got a list of different themes that come up in it. We'll talk back and forth, kind of explore it, and then it will slide into getting nerdier. And when we hit the 45-50 minute of intensity, if some of the more nerdy questions you brought up we haven't touched on, or you want to go to more specific passages, drop in the box. All right, do that. Right. And there's a high likelihood, if you just want to talk about more specific passages, that we like doing it. But we're going to try to slide down a funnel of grad schooliness.
Well, hopefully we don't get stuck somewhere in the middle, like in a water slide with not enough water moving you through it, right?
Oh, all right. All right. Gosh. It's your turn. It's your turn, Aaron.
Tag. So
that postscript.
So it is a hard task in general to talk about any philosopher in a technical enough way to make it non-superficial, while at the same time, one of the great challenges of philosophy is philosophers can make simple things very, very complex, but we are not as good at making complex things simple. And yet one of the things, I think it was actually C.S. Lewis who said somewhere that making complex things simple must be the task of all great thinkers, because the point of thinking well is to invite living well. So I appreciate the comments that we've received and the discussions on Facebook, trying to help us figure out how to hit that middle balance, and we'll do our best. And I should say, before I dive in, I apologize to everybody on Facebook. I've not been quite as prominent in my comments this week, but it was because I had family here the whole time. So I tried to respond as much as I could, but I will again hop back on tonight as soon as we're done and go back and reply to all the comments. However, did you know this, Tripp? I don't know what the exact number, 8, 9, 10 things you do on Facebook in too short a time, it like locks you. So I keep getting blocked.
They don't like that.
I keep getting blocked on the Walking with Kierkegaard and have to wait half an hour to get unblocked to come back in. So yeah, if it ever looks like I have gotten all but 3, it's probably because I got to those and then it kicked me out. So we'll get back to it as soon as we get done tonight.
I mean, when I think of spammy, I think of philosophers.
I need a big shirt with a can of Spam on the front and Lessing's Ditch on the back. So the postscript is explicitly meant to be a postscript, an afterword to the book Philosophical Crumbs or Philosophical Fragments, written by Johannes Climacus. However, it is a really weird postscript since it's significantly longer than the book it is a postscript to. And Climacus, who identifies as a humorist, in many ways is kind of, playing with the audience and almost joking with them in the fact that, look at this postscript. And he keeps referring to it as a pamphlet. And yet it's freaking huge. So if you had the whole book, it is not a small book. And the reason that he's doing this is, as Hong and Hong mentioned in a little short introduction, this is not really a postscript to the fragments full stop. It is a postscript to the fragments in that it is the same author taking up the same questions, which we'll get to in a minute, but it's really meant to be a kind of postscript to Kierkegaard's authorship. This was the book that he thought would be kind of the conclusion of his work. It would kind of finish stuff up and especially finish the parallel of signed and pseudonymous texts coming out sort of in unison. So when he writes this book, it is written in a way that is, again, like I mentioned, very existential. And I think part of why it's done this way, as we've discussed for 3 weeks, he's trying his best to get inside these different stages. Well, this book is not explicitly written from a particular stage. So it's not like a perspective on Christianity written from the ethical or the aesthetic. It's instead a humorist who is not a Christian, but who is fascinated by what it would take to become one. And that idea of becoming immediately throws us into the lived context for thinking and action. So what this book does is takes up really 2 questions. The first question is the question that is sort of appropriated from Philosophical Crumbs or Fragments. And this is the question of how is it that we get historical truth, historical awareness, to be of what he calls eternal significance? How is it that we're able to make that connection? And this is, of course, really important. And Lessing wrestled with this as well, hence all the early stuff on Lessing, because it's really a strange idea that something which is intrinsically contingent, everything that happens historically could have happened otherwise, is Kierkegaard's basic view, and Climacus is defending that view. If it could have happened otherwise, how is it that the way it happened taken to be of necessary significance for all eternity? How is it that we find some historical occurrence, in this case, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ as an historical occurrence? How is it that that event is now of utmost importance to Christian identity, to what it means to identify as Christian? So that initial question of the relationship between history and the historical truth, so we might say the epistemic realities attending historicality, and this idea of its theological significance is sort of point 1. Point 2, the second question that he's really engaging, is where the first question gets sort of, doubled down on. It's like, if you've seen the movie Swingers, right? It's like they drew 11 in blackjack. It's like you always double down on 11. For Climacus, if we're talking about the theological significance of an historical event, what we're asking about is the very status of how truth works. what does it mean to talk about something being true? And this is where we get into this big question of what's the difference and what's the significance of distinguishing between objective and subjective truth. Now, here we've got to be really, really careful because we live in a cultural space or context where objective truth is often, identified as science, and subjective truth is identified as the kind of stuff that philosophers and theologians and poets do. That is very much not what Climacus and Kierkegaard are interested in unpacking. Instead, what they're trying to do is appreciate the value of objective truth, right? You and I both very thankful that we have objectively verifiable data sets that are supporting the safety and effectiveness of the COVID vaccine. We are appreciative of the fact that your cold house is not as cold as it would be were it not for the objective data that is provided by, electricians and HVAC repair people, right? Like we need objective stuff in order to navigate the world as effectively as we do. Climacus and Kierkegaard are not opposed to that. But what they do remind us is none of the objective way of approaching things gets us to what is, as they put it, essential to the existing practice of individual life. What does it mean to be a poor existing individual? And why does that matter? Well, this is where Climacus says part of what he's trying to do is make simple things really difficult because the thing that we thought was the most simple, remember, was being a Christian. All you got to do is show up at the church and get baptized. Like, what could be more difficult than that? What could be more difficult than, in my tradition, going to the altar every night of youth camp every summer? This is just what you do. So the idea of making this hard, he's not trying to say so fewer people get to be Christians. He's trying to make sure that we understand so that we don't confuse what is true in Christianity and the way Christian theological truth functions. We don't confuse it with something like a mathematical premise. We don't confuse it with some sort of, scientific data set. We don't confuse it with some sort of apologetic algorithm. And why this is important is because it invites us to realize that there is not, and there was some questions about this on Facebook this week, there's not a dismissiveness in Kierkegaard / Climacus about objective doctrine in Christian theology. Their point is instead to say, when we get so obsessed with the objectivity of the right doctrinal claims, we've actually failed to make it come alive as our very lives. It's not the gravity around which we circulate. It ends up being something that we simply hold and move on. But we've seen that logic several times now. We saw it in his journal when he was 23 years old, right? I've got all this knowledge, but who cares if it's not true for me? If I don't put it into action in my life, which is what I kept calling not just orthopathy, not just orthopraxis, but orthopathy, right? It's an affective engagement and appropriation. We saw this again in Fear and Trembling, where he says, hey, it's not the case that faith is something you can go further than. It's the furthest. Living faithfully is the task. So now we come back to that and we see that truth is subjectivity for Climacus. Well, that doesn't mean truth is whatever you want it to be. That doesn't mean that truth is just subjective, that it is like Emerson, right? Whim above the lintels of the doorposts. It's instead an attempt to say, let's assume that the story, the narrative of God in time, named Jesus by Christians, that this is in fact the case. This is an accurate description of a state of affairs, mind independently existing, right? If that's true, Climacus's point is, does saying yes to that make you Christian? And his answer is no. And the thought here is actually one that is pretty simple. Even people who know the Bible will know the demons believe in God, right? So it's not that the belief doesn't matter. It's that the belief misses what's really the heart of faithful living, which is the lived commitment. And that lived commitment, which he calls essential knowing, or sometimes ethico-religious knowing, is what draws us deeper, not into doctrine, but into relationship with what he calls the absolute paradox, that God, the eternal, existed in time as a limited body. So the incarnation is, for Climacus, one of those things that can't be made sense of in objective fashion, because to do so requires that we start, getting really weird when it comes to questions of contradictions, ideas of how things work. And he says early on, I'm not trying to deny the law of non-contradiction, but I'm trying to stress the paradoxical nature of what Christianity offers and invites. So it's not inviting us to be an abstract ego, what he keeps calling the I. He's inviting us to be the poor existing individual in our context who is becoming contemporary with the absolute paradox of the eternal existing in time. And when we do this, we shift from the objective emphasis on what is true and shift to the subjective emphasis on how it is true. And the how here is we are invested, we are embarked, as Sartre would say. This is what opens the space by which my identity then plays out, rather than being simply the belief that I hold as I go about being who I am. And this is then what gives rise ultimately to a distinction between a results-based focus on being to a process-focused orientation toward becoming. So when he says truth is subjectivity, subjectivity is truth, what he's trying to do is invite us into the idea of becoming a Christian, becoming the sort of person who is ever more fully in earnestness invested in the absolute paradox of what he calls the God-man, the absolute paradox being at the center of how we then narrate ourselves and our identity in the world. So that general structure, though it sounds really, really, really Christian, right? And on the one hand, it is. On the other hand, again, I think we miss Kierkegaard if we try to get rid of the theology. But I think we also miss the impact of Kierkegaard, especially on the existentialists, if we only stay theological. So what is it he's done? He's basically, in this text, invited us to focus on what Sartre will eventually call the radical freedom of existential existence. It is the freedom by which I am responsible for making the world. That's what Climacus means when he says, at the end of the day, subjectivity is truth. You are responsible for what will be true in your world. How then will you choose? How will you decide? This is then where Heidegger talks about being in a world. We are always contextually located. Here we see Climacus talk about the very same thing by saying, I'm a poor existing individual. I can't be this fictitious, abstracted, idealist, noumenal self. This is what we see in people like Simone de Beauvoir, who think really carefully about questions of embodiment. And Climacus is effectively saying, look, unless you take seriously that the existence of God in time is as a body with limitations, you won't understand the impact of this paradox. So this is where we find Kierkegaard as existentialist, but it's also where we find Kierkegaard via Climacus inviting us into an awareness that it's not important ultimately what you take to, or exclusively what you take to be true. It's more important, if you take it to be true, that you're then willing to live into the risk of affirming it at the center of your identity. And that's where, when I define faith, the whole class, right, all 4 weeks, faith is risk with direction. That doesn't have to be directed toward God or directed toward Christ or directed toward the Bible. Risk with direction is however you choose to be invested in what is essential to who you are becoming. That's then what faith will be for you. So when he's critical of objectivity, again, it's not actually a critique of science. It's a critique of those Christians, those religious leaders, those philosophers who act as if we could have certainty relative to existential matters. But when we realize we're not going to get certainty, and the goal is not to get probability, the goal is to be invested, to be passionate. That's where we again will run up against some hard questions, right? How does this not lead to a kind of zealotry? Does it really matter not at all then about the what? If it's the how, can't I just believe, crazy conspiracy theories about QAnon if I believe it with all the interiority of my passion? Is that okay? These are hard questions. And I think Climacus gives us resources for addressing them. But those realities, those questions of who is it that you are now becoming is ultimately the question that this text asks us. And it's also what the authorship demands of us. Who are you becoming? Because that question is the most difficult of all. And yet we take it to be the most obvious, the most simple, the most grounded. And he says, once you see how hard it is to take seriously the task of becoming, you then can become more compellingly engaged with the finitude that defines all of us. Last point, little footnote at the very end, we see Kierkegaard come back around and he says, hey, just in case you were confused, this has all been me, folks. So he does this long review. It's called A Glance at Contemporary Danish Literature. And it's this long review of basically all the books that Kierkegaard himself wrote, now being sort of announced as, yeah, this was me. Everyone knew this, by the way, in contemporary Denmark. It wasn't a big secret. But this is where Kierkegaard's kind of, saying, look, I'm coming out from behind the curtain. And this is why, if you notice on the title page of this text, it's edited by S. Kierkegaard, because Kierkegaard's now emerging as a voice behind the voices in a way that earlier on, his voice was very discreetly differentiated from what was authored under the pseudonyms. So I'll stop there, but hopefully that sets up. The only thing I didn't mention was religiousness A and B, but we can maybe unpack that as we go, since it technically wasn't in the reading for tonight. I figured that can maybe unpack as we develop the thoughts.
All right. Well, yeah, we have to talk about religiousness A and B, because you don't want to go for a walk with Kierkegaard and not be able to use his one religious binary. Basically, other times he complicates any strict divisions. There's a couple different entry points for getting at what he's doing, and I wonder if we might start with some more specifically theological topics, and then back in more to the philosophical side.
Sounds good.
And maybe we could begin with what this vision of truth that he's talking about does to God. Because and in one of the times he goes on his little excursus is pretty entertaining. It's on page 220. I'll just say, as a parent, I've said this to my son quite a few times when getting really bad questions that his friends ask him, and he's like, why are they asking about this? Like, where was God before the Big Bang? Or something like that, or whatever. And I say, Elgin, God doesn't exist. God's eternal. And
so Tripp, I used to give talks at churches. This is probably why I got kicked out of so many. But I used to give talks at churches where I would start with the following line: I'm a Christian because I don't believe God exists. It turns out that doesn't endear you to the church audience, but it's actually this claim: God does not exist; He is eternal. That claim is why I used to use that phrase, but yeah, it never worked out.
So the line, and actually that whole page is a real beautiful one, but God does not think, He creates. God does not exist, He is eternal. A human being thinks and exists. An existence separates thinking and being, holds them apart from each other in succession.
Right.
So when you think, what does Kierkegaard mean when he uses the word God, and what about it is most offensive, right, to the kind of more naive account of Christianity, and maybe what's its invitation for those seeking to take the risk of faith real seriously?
Yeah, I think this is such a good question. And I was looking for the other passage that I think, 197, I think, is where we need to start in order to unpack that. So, bottom of 197, it says, a system of existence cannot be given. Is there then not such a system? That is not at all the case. Now, if you just glance at this, you'd think, well, that's a contradiction. It can't be given, but it's not the case that there isn't one. Well, what he's trying to do here is say the crux is, can we articulate it? Can it be given by us? And his answer is no. Neither is this implied, right, that there is no system in what has been said. Existence itself is a system for God, but it cannot be a system for any existing spirit. System and conclusiveness, and by conclusiveness, we could say certainty, comprehensiveness, correspond to each other, but existence is the very opposite. Now, this is crucial because what he's trying to do is say existence is a matter of inconclusiveness. It is a matter of uncertainty. It is a reality by which risk is definitive, precisely because I would say our embodied finitude is necessarily the framework in which, as he puts it, we live forwards, right? We are only ever living forwards. We can understand backwards, but we can never live backwards. So if we understand this passage, and I would say, by the way, that this is Climacus overstates his case here. And Merrill Westphal and I both have made this case quite a bit in print, where it says existence itself is a system. What it should say is existence, it seems, is a system, or existence, best we can tell, is a system. In other words, to say that existence is a system for God still assumes that we can somehow get outside of our existence to talk about what is the case for God. But that's precisely what we can't do because we're existing.
Right.
Now,
so do you think that, like, the two features, like you've hinted at, that might be important to know is any existent individual has a number of things. Time, they're in time, right? The notion of becoming is real essential. They had a beginning, and then they have an end. And part of even the identity of the thing involves its own experience of duration. And it doesn't exist everywhere. It exists somewhere. So it's located. And in that located is this ongoing flux of existence. And that means it's very simple. Things like that. You are embedded, you're situated, you are in a context. Your engagement with the rest of the world is always determined by the space and the situation you're in. You don't get to opt out. And so if you had the idea of the perfect system, right, then how do you do that? Right. Because you are somewhere and some win.
That's exactly right.
And so if we think we get God right by describing the world in all truth as if it is perfectly organized as a set of objects, be it with a lot of Bible footnotes or the perfect translation of the original documents or whatever your creed. I mean, anytime the concept God equals some set of affirmations that are ideas finite beings in some place, somewhere, and sometime came up with, then you just get the concept of God wrong, because God is not located in some place and not other places, in some time and not other time. And it's not the nature of God to be part of the flux of finitude, because God is infinite. God is eternal. Like,
That's right.
In many ways, he's here. That observation, right, is grounded in like robust scholasticism. Like, you don't predicate things, apply to God categories that finite beings have, except his observation is about what that means for the person of faith, not what it means for your big system of theology, what it means for the person of faith.
And it's crucial because, and I should actually say, just a caveat here for the listeners. It's important to understand, though it can sometimes sound like Tripp and I are engaging these things in the same way because we're both using similar language. You, Tripp, always are engaging this from the perspective of theologian, which is awesome. I never do, because I am not a theologian. I am a philosopher. And those distinctions in perspective lead to, I think, some really compelling, not disagreement, but nuance that, we sometimes try to tease out. And that difference is the difference, in fact, between Climacus, who's trying to ask all these questions as philosopher, and Kierkegaard, who is theologically invested as someone committed to becoming a Christian. And so when you find even some tensions in postscript, I think that tension is a tension between this philosopher theologian identity. But you're right. Our contextual location doesn't have to be a big, deep theological idea. This is just what we might call perspectivalism. It's the idea that you can't ever know except as someone, somewhere, and some when, right? So those facts don't then mean necessarily that you can't have knowledge, you can only have guesses. Doesn't mean that you may not be able to access objective truth about various things. It definitely doesn't mean that there isn't some state of affairs that is the case mind independently. It just means that all of your claims in relation to such accounts should be articulated with an embodied humility, grounded in an awareness of how existence works. So when it says back to 220 that God does not think, God creates, the whole idea here is because thinking is something that existing beings do to try to connect being and thought, right? What we're trying to do is truth, we think, is the adequation or the correspondence between thinking and being. So if there is a red cup on my table and I think there is a red cup on the table, well, then I am thinking something true because my thought is corresponding or adequate to what is the case outside my thought. But notice I'm using spatial metaphors, thought in here, world out there, which is already a really bizarre move, because the whole idea is I could only think this as a body already invested in a world whereby I drink out of this thing before I stop to use it as an example in my, philosophy class, right? So God does not think is simply a way of saying God's primary activity is not trying to figure stuff out, right? God's primary activity is to create, to give life to make actual. We spend most of our time trying to figure out what is actual, because our location and our limitations make that a real challenge. God does not exist. God is eternal. Because what is existence? Necessary limitation. And so when we talk about eternality here, I actually think one of the really good questions in this text, and I don't know ultimately where I come down, there's debate on this, is whether eternality here entails atemporality. In other words, does this mean God is not temporal, or does it just mean that God has all time present to God's awareness? And this is an interesting question, right?
Well,
but
that's very tempting for our extremely nerdy excursus. So
maybe we can
bring that up at the end.
We'll put a pin there and come back to it, right?
Okay, let me ask you a question, because here, one of the other questions that came in around this topic around God was, so is Kierkegaard making a point by harassing apologists, or does he just think the desire for the proof of God's existence, is it just inherently problematic? Now, you and I both taught philosophy of religion classes.
Oh, yeah.
And we know that you do not get to dodge spending so many precious pages and time talking about the proofs for God's existence. So, like,
yeah, I just did Anselm last week, man. Yeah.
Well, Kierkegaard and Anselm would probably have fun hanging out, but the modern version of his argument may be less enticing. But so, well, how does Kierkegaard's understanding of truth and the quest for seeking it impact a lot of the kind of late modern religious type of philosophy that seeks to prove objectively and publicly and things the reality of God or Jesus and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, I mean, so this question's getting at your earlier question of, so what would bug folks about this account of God? And what bugs folks is, this is an account of God that you don't get to be cocky about. You don't get to lord over others that you've got the right doctrine and they're all wrong. But what is it apologetics does in its kind of late modern, what I describe as popular apologetics or apologetics Inc., as opposed, again, to like pros doing stuff, in philosophy seminars. Well, what the Apologetics Inc. is about, in my opinion, is trying to make it easy to believe Christian theistic doctrine. And by easy, I mean, it allows for some sort of epistemic certainty. This is just obvious to any rational person who had the courage to investigate the questions, right? Evidence that demands a verdict. This is just then how now we should live, right? So all of these approaches, I mean, the case for Christ simply is really, really good, right? Like when we read these sorts of texts, what we get is not an invitation into risk, right? Or as he puts it on, one of my favorite passages is where he talks about being 207. The definition of truth stated above is a paraphrasing of faith. Without risk, no faith. Faith is, so that's a definitional statement. That's a big deal, right? This is like, red letter text when he's defining things. Faith is the contradiction between the infinite passion of inwardness, namely this essential knowing, this investment in who we're becoming, this awareness that we've got to, receive finitude as a gift, like we saw with Abraham, and the objective uncertainty. Well, Then he goes on, if I am able to apprehend God objectively, which is precisely what popular apologetics is all about, I do not have faith because I can't do this, in other words, because I can't apprehend God objectively. Why? Because I'm an existing poor individual, right? So the fact that it's not a system for me, that God is not a system for me, means I don't get to be able to do this apologetic work and think that therefore, quod ergo demonstratus, it has been proved. I must have faith. Now, what we would normally say is, well, then faith is just weak knowledge. It's uncertainty. It's what you can't prove. Tain't true, but you're going to hold on to it anyway, right? Inter-conspiracy theory, inter-QAnon. Wrong. Because if I want to keep myself in faith, I must continually see to it that I hold fast to the objective uncertainty. See to it that in the objective uncertainty, I am out on 70,000 fathoms of water and yet still have faith. What? The idea here is it's not just that you believe what you know tain't true. It's that you recognize you will never be able to close the risk gap, because it's ultimately, faith is not ultimately a matter of epistemic guessing. It's not probability that just can't quite get to 100%, right? It's instead finding myself aware of the fact that God is necessarily going to outstrip any sort of objective account I could give. And therefore, the risk is not just an epistemic lack, but the risk is an existential requirement. This is who we are. We are risky individuals. And that risk is then what allows us to keep front and center apologetics, even though it might break down barriers to belief, as Lewis puts it. Apologetics can't get me to faith, because what it does is eradicates faithfulness in the name of a success results oriented obsession with being. But what is faith? It's becoming. It's taking up your cross daily, we might say. It is what Bonhoeffer calls costly reception of grace. That view, which again, we're speaking theologically, but philosophically, I would simply narrate that as it's the awareness that you are always already embarked in some direction. You can change course with your life, but you can't change course because you know how things are going to work out. You are riskily standing on a precipice, deciding whether or not to keep climbing or jump. It's what Camus says when he says, shall we continue to live or not? That question is the very point that we see Klimek is making here, but he's doing it relative to Christian life. The problem is we, contemporary late modern capitalists, have defined Christian life as radical certainty that overcomes the craziness of the cultural milieu we call postmodernism.
Yeah.
Screw relativism, give me absolute truth. And you've got Kierkegaard Climacus showing up saying, man, that is the thing that eradicates faith, is your thought that you don't actually need it because you've got an argument.
Yeah. So in some sense, like, if God doesn't exist, then it's going to be impossible to demonstrate it.
Yes.
If God, at least the God of Abraham, does exist, then it's foolish to really want to demonstrate it.
That's exactly right. And this is the foolishness.
Like in a compelling, in a way that requires assent, not like foolish to go, oh, how would this connect with this, or trying to articulate it thoughtfully, but like to think this is an object that I've now demonstrated. That is a bit.
Well, it's idolatry, right? I mean, it's foolish because, and this is where, a really weird set of passages that do harken back to philosophical crumbs and fragments is where it says subjectivity is truth only if subjectivity is originally untruth, which is bizarre, right? And you're like, oh, come on, this is the kind of nonsense that Derrida does. Wrong. Well, yes, that's what Derrida does, but it's not nonsense. It's actually, Klimek is saying, it's only when we recognize that who we take ourselves to be originally and for the most part, and here I'm quoting Heidegger, our everyday sense of being is actually distracting us from who we in fact need to be, right? So we can only live into truth if we realize the selves that our culture and our world has invited us to be: objective, social roles, living in the ethical, defining ourselves by our external successes, right? That move is precisely untruth. By being the selves we've been trained to be in our society, we are in untruth. And we can only identify subjectivity as truth when we realize that that conception of identity is so mistaken and misguided, right? That's where we are then opened onto the task of becoming rather than the excitement of being. And this is a really easy idea, right? Again, I know we're deploying a lot of name dropping, but it's an easy idea. And here's the simplest way I know how to put this. If If you think faith is a matter of objective proofs, if you think faith is ultimately a matter of knowing Christian doctrine is objectively absolutely true, or if you think faith is affirming it as objectively true, right, which is probably a better way to put it, then for Kierkegaard and Climacus, you have created a space where Christian truth ultimately is a product of historical articulation. It's a product of what we've decided is the case, right? Because we're the ones giving these arguments. The irony is, by focusing on history, by focusing on the contingency, on the embodiment, on our being in a world, Kierkegaard and Climacus actually remind us that it's not about what we decide to be true in the world. It's about our decision to live into a history that is ruptured by the eternal. But that means that you're going to have to be real humble. If you think you got God figured out, you're probably an idolater. The best way to put this, I think, is something I've mentioned sort of in passing before. God is trouble, or God is nothing. God is trouble for your conceptions of God, or God is nothing but those conceptions. God is trouble for your self-sufficiency and self-righteousness in your Christian identity, or God is nothing other than a name for your social privilege. God is trouble for the ease with which you cite the Bible as literal truth, or God is nothing other than a objective historical fact. So when we realize that God is trouble, that doesn't mean that the whats don't matter. It just means that how you relate to those whats has to be under the guise of risk. So embrace the risk, and in doing so, stand contemporary with a God in time, which is something that is not only foolish for the Greeks, but offensive, he says, to all of those who think that God would never be this, right? God's too big, too holy, too good, too great. That's Greek metaphysics. And what we in fact see is a narrative in Christianity that says, nah, God is lower than the lowest. God is humbled as the maximal expression of divinity. God is servant. God is powerful in kenosis, in powerlessness. That cannot be argued for because the categories of rational argumentation are owing to the Greek metaphysics that this subverts.
Yeah.
Right?
So there are a couple questions that are connecting how he understands or trying to articulate truth, and then the role kind of the eternality or infinity type things around God play out with how the incarnation functions for the event and risk of faith. But before we get, like, in a sense, shift from God to Jesus in the incarnation, I think one of the threads that runs through the reading and the book in general and philosophical investigations is the connection between the risk of faith in God and the risk of love in marriage. It's he brings out in a number of footnotes in our reading, like 195 or wait, somewhere around there. 191 to 192 in the bottom of a footnote, but it's a regular Kierkegaard thing. We didn't get to read the parable of the king and the lowly maiden, which I basically will cry if I read it. Thank you, Andrea, for reminding me that I have cried reading it on the podcast years ago. I brought it up to someone that was on the podcast and like, I don't know if I've ever heard that. And I just, bad podcasting. I'm like, hold on, let me go get it. And I just am reading it, and they're not nearly as into it as I am. And I'm like, how does this, but I think it's helpful, right? Because in some sense, if you ask someone like, are you married? and you say yes, the primary thing you're referencing is not the legal agreement.
Right.
Even though you can love the institution of marriage, but you love the institution because of the living relationship with this mysterious other that you only encounter because you've chosen to show up for life in existence with this person. And it's finite,
and risking divorce at every step, right? Risking loss of love. That's right.
Yeah. And so the, like that one line where he says, explaining why he would use an erotic relationship to talk about God. It will, if a maiden in love yearns for the wedding day, because this would give her assured certainty. If she wanted to make herself comfortable in legal security as a spouse, if she preferred marital yawning to maidenly yearning, then the man would rightfully deplore her unfaithfulness, although she indeed did not love anyone else, because she would have lost the idea and actually did not love him.
That's right.
Right. And you hear that, and the presumed patriarchy aside, given his own relationship with Regina, that loving relationship, it's like, you don't, if you're a Christian, it's not because you love the church or you're a good citizen of Denmark.
Yep.
And if you just point back to the institutions, you miss the point. The institutions are a relic of a life that of this vibrant becoming that's taking place within it. And if you confuse one for the other, you miss the point.
Yeah. I mean, and this is why it's so cool. The last line of that footnote, he says, this, after all, is the essential unfaithfulness in an erotic relationship. This idea that you love marriage more than your spouse.
Yeah.
The incidental unfaithfulness is that she just loves someone else, right? Like, if you're going to cheat on me, at least cheat with another person, because that's less significant than cheating on me with an idea, right? At least you're still faithful to what love is. You've just been unfaithful to me. But when you love the idea, you don't even understand what love means, because the idea can't betray you. It's not risky. It's not lived also. So you're exactly right. I mean, this is similar to what we talked about. It was last week, a week before, where I said, existence is the least interesting thing about my wife. Like, why do I love her? Let me count the ways. Well, she exists. That is not in my top 5. And so that's ultimately what it means to say God does not exist. He's not suggesting there is no God in some sort of atheistic thesis. He's saying existence is the least interesting thing about what would be true of God. In the same way that existing is the most interesting thing for us insofar as it is the context of love, right? So if I were, as a Kierkegaardian, to say the most interesting thing about my wife is that she exists, I would be saying something very different than objective thinking. I would be saying my wife, like me, is becoming. Our love is a becoming investment. It's risking ourselves in direction of each other. Not, I'm trying to be the good husband in an abstraction. That's the I, this idea of husband. I'm trying to be a good husband to Vanessa today. And you know what? I might be bad at it today, but maybe tomorrow I'll get a little bit better, because we are still risked in union. And at some level, this is where I think one of the great moves of this text is to remind us that unless we embrace that difficulty, that you can't have it all figured out, we miss everything that matters. And this is ultimately, some people might be really interested in the whole direct, indirect communication debate that kind of shows up in passages here. All he means by that is direct communication is where I just give you the data set. You either accept or reject the data set. It's here's this certain claim. It lays claim on you, but you can reject it at the cost of your rationality. Sure, believe that January 6th was actually just an act of patriotism from freedom-loving Americans. You've now lost credibility as a rational human. believe that
tourists. They were tourists.
They were tourists, right?
Yeah.
Out for it got a
I'm
little
glad
out
you
of
corrected
hand.
that.
But the whole point would be, this is irrationality. Sure, I saw somebody this week say that Omicron, the variant, of course, there's a new variant because this is when we've got the midterms getting ready to start rolling. You need a new variant to scare people up. And you're like, oh, good God, I don't know how to make sense of this, because they're rejecting the objective certainty in the name of radical irrationality. That irrationality is not faith. That irrationality is they're just bad at reason giving. But notice, being bad at reason giving is not the same as being a good lover, right? There's this great Donovan Woods song called Good Lover. It might go on our Kierkegaard playlist. And this idea of being a good lover is, I'm invested in the idea that there will be a lot of days when I'm bad at this. And that awareness is what he means when he says, when you're out on 70,000 fathoms, you keep in the front of your mind, this may not turn out well. But it's in keeping that in the front of your mind. I might not be a good husband today. I might not be a good lover today. But that awareness is what then calls me to task to say, it's not about being a good lover today and then walking off stage with my George Costanza hands thrown up, right? Thank you and good night. I'm now thinking of the shrimp joke, right? So the idea instead is, the jerk store called, like, you don't get to walk out on jerk store punchlines. You instead remain ever more invested. And that ever more investment is why indirect communication is the only thing available. What is indirect communication? It's where we are saying something, but what we're saying is announcing the question that then calls me forward in my own existence. What he calls double reflection. I'm not just reflecting on what is true, but I am reflecting on what is true, articulating that truth to the best of my ability, and then throwing myself back into that truth as a lived task, whereby I've now got to re-articulate it as I continue to live into it. I can't just say that as if you could then pick it up. I've got to say it in a way that invites you to engage in that lived task yourself. This is why anybody who has kids, when you're talking to somebody who's expecting a child, right, whether adoption or natural birth or whatever the case may be, like, man, you don't get to say, oh, here's what it's like. Now, that anybody who thinks they could write that book doesn't have kids, because all that you can say is, man, you'll understand someday, right? In other words, once you live forwards into this objective uncertainty, you will then be able to understand backwards the fact that there is no way you could have had that certainty. It doesn't work that way, right?
Oh, yeah, and that kind of stuff. I mean, that same kind of, you have to go into it. It's not just true, right, for having kids or for a marriage. If you're a youth minister, you think it every time you see a sixth grader, right? They're on the cusp of adolescence, and you're like, oh, I've done it once and I'm not doing it again, right? And
my son's sixth grade right now, and boy, he thinks he has got life and existence figured out as a system. But what is it that we then say in our 40s looking at our sixth graders? We don't say, maybe his account is objectively the case. What we say is, man, like, dude's 12. He'll eventually figure it out. That's basically what Climacus is saying to all of these Christians running around trying to write the apologetics textbook that will answer the questions. He's like, okay, sixth graders, you've apparently got life handled, don't you? Right? Or when I've got the 18-year-old students in my classes who basically think like they've understood all of philosophy because they took that, AP or IB philosophy course back in high school. And you're like, okay, like maybe you can help me think about something more effectively. Let's do it. But you know what really great philosophers are aware of? That humility is the condition of truth seeking. and that's something that not a lot of 18-year-old philosophers have gotten figured out. So that's ultimately all indirect communication is. And again, we could make it a lot more complicated, but that's all it is just you have to invite that sixth grader to live a little bit. Mm-hmm. You're still communicating. You're still trying to give them some guardrails. You're still trying to convey to them stuff that matters. Today in class, I did my best to invite my students. One of them asked a great question. His name's George, really amazing philosopher. He says, so Dr. Simmons, how is it that we can live faithfully in light of the fact that when you stare into the abyss as a philosopher, the abyss stares back and it might just swallow you alive? That's a freaking good question. And my response was actually, knowing we're going to talk about Kierkegaard tonight, I said, well, when you look at the abyss, maybe you should stop thinking that you're going to find answers there. Right? Because it will likely swallow you alive because you aren't finding the periods that you thought or the exclamation points that you were hoping for. You just get more questions. But can you be somebody who's okay living in light of questions and then recognizing that periods announce the faithfulness that your life will then narrate?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, a lot of times the quest for certainty is like quicksand. The more you go after it, the worse the situation gets, because you get more and more anxious because you're missing it. And then you have more and more.
But see,
problems.
this is Kierkegaard's example at 23, when at the very end of that journal entry where he says, look, if it's like a man stuck in a bog or quicksand who is trying to figure out exactly the rate at which he is sinking, only to realize that in the time it takes to figure out the rate that you're sinking, you've sunk more. Right.
So you're saying I read that 4 weeks ago, forgot he wrote it, and then said it back to you in relationship to Kierkegaard.
I'm clearly thinking that's what's going on. That's right.
No.
That you're teaching us Kierkegaard by forgetting that you read Kierkegaard.
Well,
right.
Well, in that case, hypothetically, let's imagine there's a king. And there are a couple of people who miss it. You can't bring up the king and the maiden, lowly maiden story and not tell it.
Everybody got their Kleenex?
No. I'll do it quickly, but it's actually connected. I think. I
don't know if you run this into Elgin talking about Sam, we'll never get out of here, man. Yeah, like this will be a freaking Hallmark homebrew.
We have at least 20 minutes before I can make a Tolkien reference. But the incarnation is like example supreme, right? Of indirect communication and why it's necessary in so many ways. And right. I think that there is a sense that for those who are reading Kierkegaard as people of faith, it's always important to catch this weird concept that seems to make his reading more difficult, right? Like he's occupying multiple people's spaces, blah, 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 going on and on. Mm-hmm. Underneath it is because he really thinks the best communicator and the best one to give an invitation to faith was God in Christ.
That's
and
right.
That means what is necessary for faith? You can't eliminate the risk. What else is necessary for faith? Genuine love. What does that need? Actual relationships. God can't just show up as an object in our field and go, are you into this? Because that power and perfection would demand assent. And then you would never have the openness and the kind of the subjectivity and mystery necessary for love. Right. And so the whole incarnation, the God man is the infinite finite. It's the paradox. It's the very means by which, if in the story, the king fell in love, like desires to love a maiden, but if the king rolls out there, it's like, what's up? I'm king. Do you want to be queen? Right? Like he would never know if she really loved him. And so what does the king have to do? Go get gross out the fingernails, get dirt under them, get calluses, and then slowly get to work in the stable that she's in, and then meet and get to know her. Then he finds that this desire that he had from the outside is even deeper once you get to know her, that tending, like the horses and all this kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden when the opportunity arises, when he recognizes this desire that he has for her is reciprocal, and he says, will you marry me? And she says, yes, it is completely, she's giving herself fully to him. And it's at that moment that she discovers that what she's inherited is the wealth. And what does God say? All that's mine is yours.
Yeah.
And all that's yours is mine. Right? Like, that story is like the most Lutheran thing of all time.
Well, it's weird. I was watching a Jennifer Lopez movie last night called an Unfinished Life. It's actually really quite good. Robert Redford and Morgan Freeman. But while I'm watching this, for some reason, all the way through it, this is such a disastrous analogy to what you're saying. I kept singing, I'm still Jenny from the block, right? The whole time. Used to have a little, now I have a lot. And I kept realizing, wrong. If you're having to tell somebody you're still that person, you ain't that person. Because the idea of having to narrate yourself as still being the girl from the block driving up in your Bentley or your Maybach, right? Then you aren't that person from the block. The whole idea is, can you actually still navigate the block without people seeing you as the pop star? Have you maintained those relationships, right?
Well, the I'm still Jenny from the block. I think, it'd be, but you're not Jenny of the block.
That's right.
And I think that's what both what Kierkegaard's getting at in the incarnation, in the king who becomes a peasant.
Right? You have to be the peasant in order for the relationship to you to be worthy of the king.
And so, in some sense, if the response of faith comes, or if the response of faith comes, it's more likely to come through indirect communication, then what kind of suspicion does that mean that we cultivate as people of faith towards institutions, to regimes and such that feel the need for direct, objective, closed, final communication is actually necessary and the Lord's work, in a sense.
Sign the faith statement. That's right.
Yeah, just think of like if Kierkegaard read a track with the Roman road in it, would he finish it, or would he be so triggered by the third verse that he loses his biscuits? And I don't know if Danish people have biscuits, but
I'm trying to think Kierkegaard dropping biscuits as he walks across Denmark. So there you go. It's such a good question, because we're going to see this, especially 2 weeks from now when we read Practicing Christianity and some of his later work, because he thinks that we really should be very suspicious. But the reason that we should be suspicious is not because this is bad. It's fine in a domain where objectivity is the space that is appropriate, right? You should be objectively the case about your political program. You should be walking around giving people tracts. Here's what we stand for. Here's what we're going to enact. Because what it is that you're saying is, here is this radically contingent fact that we are putting out in front of you in a ironically non-offensive way, right? Or it should be non-offensive, in order to garner public support. It's about the results being more people voting for your party. But look at how different that is from 191. Whereas objective thinking invests everything in the result and assists all humankind to cheat by copying and reeling off the results and answers. Wait a minute. Were we talking about politics, or are we talking about an apologetics weekend at the youth group? Right? When they hit you with the problem of evil, pow, free will defense. No question there. What?
Yeah. 191. All of you that are looking for the page, first full paragraph.
Subjective thinking, alternatively, invests everything in the process of becoming and omits the results, partly because this belongs to him since he possesses the way, partly because he, as existing, is continually in the process of becoming, as is every human being who has not permitted himself to be tricked into becoming objective, into inhumanely becoming speculative thought. So I think what he would say to that church or that organization or that institution or whatever it is that is all about the objective way, and here's what we do, and here's what we affirm, he'd basically be saying, wow, when was it that you stopped being an existing being? When did you become pastor and stop being person? Right? I remember years ago, I was talking to a buddy of mine who also is a fan of Kierkegaard and Tillich and Bonhoeffer and Simone Weil and others. And I was telling him how frustrated I was because I was attending a church at the time where they kept sort of not pressuring, but inviting us to go to membership class. And I kept saying to the pastor, I don't believe in membership because it doesn't make any sense to me. And I was telling my friend this, and he said to me, isn't that strange? So why would you ever want to attend a church that would deny membership because people didn't believe the way they do? And I was like, yeah, like that's Kierkegaard's point, right? It's not just if you say yes to this, you're good. It's instead, are you invested in the messiness of trying to become in a direction modeled by the humility found in the person of Christ? Now, again, said in a non-theological way, why would you want to hang out with people who think that, quoting Outcast, that, their poop don't smell? It smells like roses. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Like, why is it that we find ourselves there? Those ain't people I want to rock with. Right. I want to roll with Donovan Woods, who's saying, I'm trying to be a good lover. But I'm messing it up a lot of days. Right. So the existential point doesn't have to be cashed out in Christian terms, even though that's specifically where Kierkegaard and Climacus are taking us. It's simply the idea that your best friends are people who allow you not to be perfect. Right? Because they don't ever assume that they are. Friendship is an attempt to motivate each other toward becoming better friends. Part of the real big problem, I think I said this last week, the real big problem with the logic of white supremacy and white nationalism that critical race theory in America is trying to overcome is the origin narrative, the origin myth of America being founded in perfection and only getting better, right? I have no interest in living in the perfect country that's only getting better. I'm really interested in living in a society that is aware of its systemic problems and is doing the best job it can to own up to those in the task of becoming more just. This is why Derrida says that you are only just when you recognize that you ain't just enough. So those are the moves here. Indirect communication, subjectivity, these are all just attempts in metaphysics and epistemology, discourse and living to talk about this idea. You're becoming, you ain't got it all figured out, right? And I keep going back to, Kendrick Lamar. I mean, he says, sit down, be humble. Like that idea, we can say it objectively. Sit down, be humble, Tripp. But you ain't going to get humble just because you sit down on a chair. You will only get humble by dying to yourself and quote unquote, taking up your cross daily. So that idea of I'm in this with you, which is precisely the story that Kierkegaard is telling us across his whole authorship of a God who loves the world enough to be limited in it, to become the king who strips off the garment and lets the fingernails grow in order to say, look, the only way that love's going to be possible is like this. And it reminds me of Emmanuel Levinas, a Jewish thinker who is once asked, if he still believes the Messiah is coming. And his answer is so deeply Kierkegaardian in this sense, though, of course, we could say that Kierkegaard in this sense has a kind of Jewish sensibility about him. his response is, well, the only way we would be worthy of the coming Messiah is if we lived as if the Messiah were never going to come. Right? The only way that you're worthy of the kingdom's riches is if you're fully invested in love to the pauper, because it ain't about the riches. The only way, I say this in my TEDx talk, the only way that you will be able to navigate success well is if you are not defined by it, right? But if you're not defined by it, you're also not going to be ruined by failure, because you recognize failure as part of becoming.
It's a very Advent observation.
Okay.
Which, for those that aren't part of a community that follows the liturgical calendar, like
as a Pentecostal, I was like, at what now? That's right.
Yeah, I mean, Advent is the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas, the coming of God, right? And the whole season is kind of intentional waiting, and the prayer that runs throughout it is come, right? And every year you do it, right? It's not like you're praying for it to come once and then just come again.
Didn't it come last year? Why are we getting these candles back out? That's right.
Yeah. One of my favorite Advent hymns is called "View the Present Through the Promise," and one of the lines is, "View the present through the promise, Christ will come again. Faith despite the deepening darkness, Christ will come again." And then it goes on to talk about that the very coming of God can come within us when we recognize ourselves as the very potential space for the divine becoming, right? And Meister Eckhart says, like, what does it matter if Mary bore God if we too aren't figuring out how to do it? And I think that,
and that's Kierkegaard's notion of contemporaneity, by the way. Yeah, that's the same exact view.
Okay, because that was my transition move. I was sitting here and I said we have to talk about that and Lessing's ditch, and make a evidence that demands a verdict joke. So,
and we need to at least at some point hit on the idea of leap on 195, because it turns out Kierkegaard never, ever, ever refers to a leap of faith. And just to clarify that, we can look at why that's true.
Okay, so the contemporaneity with Christ is so I wrote a 3-sentence attempt to grasp it. Then you can unpack it however you want.
Can I just say that gets it right and leave it at
that? Probably not. Okay. But because I knew this was a more nerdy thing, and so I said, what if I write down how I would explain it if I was trying to explain it
in 3 sentences?
So contemporaneity with Christ, the Christ event, is not about its concrete whatness, but its paradoxical thatness. See, I was very impressed with this.
I can see the.
That's just the first sentence.
Oh, good Lord! So here's the game we're gonna play then, Tripp. So we'll take your 3 sentences. Then I have to narrate what you just said in 2, and then you've got to take it down to 1 sentence, and then we both get 1 word to do this.
Okay, so the 3 sentences. So you get, the Christ event is not about the concrete whatness, but it's paradoxical thatness. This is the historical disciples were existentially no closer than us to the paradoxical nature of faith. The incarnation cannot be seen or comprehended and requires an infinite leap for those who walked with Jesus and those who hear the gospel today.
Here's my 2-sentence version.
Oh, wow.
And I'm going to quote, was it Nelly? If you want to take a ride with me, we ain't gonna ride in the gold Benzie. And now flipping to T.I., the only way we will ride together is if we ride in dirty.
Yeah, you got an air horn for that one.
There's my 2-sentence version. That's right.
Yeah. So in the one sense, one would be the Jesus's response to his disciples trying to explain his whatness, and then he invites them to the thatness, and he says, "Who do you say I am?"
Yeah,
and that question is an eternal one.
And my one word response is actually one you've already mentioned. It would just be come.
Right? See, it's back to Advent. All right.
Okay.
You're into Advent. It's your first Advent Pentecostal.
Man, growing up, we had a cool 4 green candles and 1 red one in the middle that we always lit and had no idea what any of it meant, but we knew we did it every Sunday, and the red one was at Christmas. Well, see, you're explaining my childhood now.
Well, I use this year we're using the whole Celtic liturgies through Advent, and trying to be more intentional, because we can't like go to church in person and things. So which, if you're a minister, Alicia and I are both ministers, but not working at church for like this. This is our second Christmas, neither one of us working at a church. So normally that's like your busy season. And now we don't even get to go to church. And so we're home. So I think our kids are like, wow, it's like everyday Sunday school or something, but,
and my house is exactly the opposite. My wife's saying, look, we've got to get back to church more regularly, because I'm pretty sure that our son is growing up without knowing any of this stuff. Like I have failed badly in making it happen, but I'm also not reading, elven runes at night and Celtic prayers in the morning. So you've got me beat on all fronts.
Well, who knows?
That's okay. But does Elgin know all the lyrics to My President's Black by Young Jeezy? Because my son did when he was like 6. So
no,
I'll put that up against your Celtic runes.
Yeah, well, okay. I see. I was about to derail.
We've gotten derailed.
Lessing's ditch.
Yeah, take us there.
Okay, no. So here,
as if we weren't already in a ditch, but yes, let's go deeper.
Well, Kierkegaard in this. I mean, we only have sections, but in the philosophical fragments and concluding unscientific postscripts, like when he ends up bringing up Lessing and stuff. Yeah. He's using Lessing to harass, was it Jacobi, right? Is that okay? And I would love for you to tell like a present day version of the Lessing Jacobi battle, and then what it would sound like if Kierkegaard started tweeting them in a debate. I feel like I gave that as an assignment one time to students, and I was amused by it. But I think that obviously through this, there's hints at, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel.
They're all over.
There are tons of philosophers, and he's like, his style is to indirectly troll them.
Oh yeah.
But the fact, why is it that his obsession with taking Lessing's side is so kind of his fuel for his paradoxical fire?
Well, so before we dive into that, say a little bit more about, because I think you will do this better than me. How is it that you understand Lessing's ditch to function? And then I'll try to narrate that in a sort of contemporary version of Jacobi and Lessing sort of talking about what's going on in it.
Well, so like Lessing insisted that the historical cannot become the proof for the necessary or the eternal, much less any actual particular historical event. Say, right. I don't know, the resurrection of Jesus. Right. Kierkegaard,
or Beyonce's homecoming. That's right.
Yeah, and Kierkegaard, who's giving, who Lessing's harassing, right? An apologist, Jacobi. Who's like evidence that demands a verdict kind of maneuver. Yep. Kierkegaard's like, yes, thank you, Lessing. Oh, praise the Lord. Faith actually requires the risk, the leap kind of thing, in which God creates both the conditions for belief and gives the gift of belief itself. And the conditions for the belief is that the infinite became finite. So like before we talked about the kind of contemporarity thing, like the whatness, the historical Jesus is like there's tons of appropriate responses to the historical Jesus. Like even if you just think to the the story where Peter says, who in response, who do you say I am? It begins by saying like, who do people say I am? And it's like, oh, well, you're Elijah, come back, because Elijah wasn't dead. He's supposed to come back before the Messiah. Or maybe you're John the Baptist with your head stitched back on. Oh, that's reasonable, right? And maybe today, like someone goes, oh, you're a wandering cynic sage, and we've already voted all of your sayings by bead colors. Or then like NT writes like, no. Actually, he's internalized second Esdras and is the people of Israel living out faithfully the vocation of the chosen people, right? And then Gaze of Ramesh is like, no, you misunderstand, right? Like in all the historical Jesus, all those things, which can contribute in plenty of ways in a larger constructive account of something, but like those kind of things never equal the infinite paradox of the God-man. Right, like it's not demanded by anything historical, particular historic. Like you could have a videotape of the thing, and then there are other interpretations. You could see the resurrected Christ himself and think he's a gardener, and you used to hang out with him, right? So if any historical particular isn't, if the whatness or isn't the means by which faith is elicited, then what is it? Right. And so Jesus's question to Peter then is, well, who do you say I am? And Peter's answer isn't like, well, I have paid close attention to scripture. The evidence demands a verdict that you are the Christ, Son of the living God. Right. Like he gives this confession. A disciple who's going to be faithful and try to follow Jesus while screwing up and getting him in wrong says, you were the Christ, Son of the living God. And Jesus doesn't go, thank you for reading the Bible correctly. He says, my heavenly Father revealed that to you. Right? Like you got the answer right. It wasn't demanded by anything specific about me. In fact, there are plenty of good answers if you're just trying to talk about my particularities in the historical situation. And I think in that sense, Lessing, this critic, right, of kind of obviously objective building certainty, like Lessing then becomes an asset for Kierkegaard or Climacus here, because he wants to make faith harder. Everyone made it so easy. Jacoby's like, oh, it just works real good. Now you take an apologetics class, you can screw with your philosophy professors. Lessing goes, nope, you just can't get the infinite out of the finite. That's not obvious. You're not building that case. And it's like in that moment, the risk of faith, what is entailed to give yourself to something, becomes clear. And I think to me, the resonance point between that and even that passage in the synoptics and then throughout it is the disciples regularly get the identity of Jesus right. You are the Christ. The demons get it right. You even pointed that out. Right. But what is the wrestling point in the Gospels is the content of the confession. The content of the confession that they all resisted was that he was going to Jerusalem and he was going to die. What did they want? They wanted to be recognized with him. So James and John are like, can I be on your right and your left? And Jesus is like, WTF, you got to check that out. I don't know if you know what you're asking for. So it's not the, like, is he Lord, liar, lunatic? I make that joke in my first book.
Or awesome.
It's not the label. It's the content of it. Right. And the content of it requires giving yourself to the mystery of God in Christ, in this historical first century person. But you're encountering that mystery, and that mystery is not just a person. It's the infinite God who's refused to be God without us, the one that came incognito. Anyway, I just love the fact that he decides it would be like someone, like writing a book of thank yous to the new atheists for harassing bad Christians.
That's right.
Like bad apologists or whatever.
So,
you're like,
yeah, it's true though. I mean, I would side. I'll give you my modern day version of this in a second, because I think I have an example that might work. But yeah, I would just personally easily say that I get more resources for my faith out of Christopher Hitchens than I do out of books like Evidence Demands a Verdict, even though those were deeply, and I don't want to be dismissive of this, deeply influential on me when I was a young teenager coming up in church, because I think what they do, and Strobel does this stuff, and Schaeffer and others, even Mere Christianity by Lewis, which I still teach, these are very, very helpful for inviting people, especially in my Pentecostal background, inviting people who are easily deceived that Christianity or faith is just a matter of feeling, right? Just affect. And there's nothing in it that demands a kind of more nuanced, invested, reflective side. And to be honest, reading those books early on, Bill Craig's, Reasonable Faith was crucial to me early on. So I don't mean to be dismissive of them, but at the end of the day, now where I stand as a professional philosopher who's got actual views kind of out there in the public square, I find Christopher Hitchens more helpful, because what does he get right? He gets the struggles of finitude better than the vast majority of Christians out there trying to defend the glories of eternity. And I think that's a shame, really, right? And maybe the example that I was thinking about will be helpful. So this is my Lessing meets Jacoby in 2021 example. And it's actually a true-ish story. The details I will change to protect former students of mine. Imagine, and this is true. I had a former student whose brother had tragically committed suicide. And she was a student of mine, one of my advisees. We were very close. And she, on the 5th year anniversary of her brother's death, it was obviously a really hard day for her. Well, I didn't know that this was that day. Thankfully, her mom, who I had met at orientation and given them my cell number, as I always do, if you ever need me, if I can ever do anything, if I'm ever a resource for your daughter, reach out. I get a call from her mom. And it says, in tears, she said, I want you to know today's the 5th year anniversary. Our daughter may be really struggling today. And I thought, thank you so much. I'll reach out to her immediately. She said, please don't let her know that I told you, because she didn't want it to be this sort of big deal. So I, emailed the student and said, hey, thinking about you. Hope your day is going okay. You've just, been on my mind today. Let me know if you want to grab a cup of coffee. 10 minutes later, a student walks in my office. And again, all this is true up to this point. She walks into my office and says to me, hey, in tears, how could you have known? You couldn't have known. There's no way you could have known. Were you really thinking about it? And I was like, yeah. And I just wanted to tell you, God's got a plan. Everything happens for a reason. It's all okay. And let me show you the scriptures that in fact prove this. She then, of course, leaves, reaffirmed in her faith, in knowing that divine sovereignty is meticulously providential, and that no jot or tittle of human existence occurs without it being gloriously foreordained. Yeah, nope. There's the Jacoby version. She gets to my office. Here's the true version and the Lessing version. She gets to my office. How could you know? There's no way you could have known. And I was like, what do you mean? What? No, what? So today's the 5th year anniversary of his passing. I said, oh my goodness. And she's in tears. And I said, you know what? The dining hall has pretty good ices. Let's go get one. And so we walked over and we got an icy. And we were drinking an icy. And she said, it just sucks because it's raining today. Couldn't it at least be sunny? And were I Jacoby, My response, of course not. This is ordained. This is necessary. This is something we can make sense of. The objective certainty we can have is that God's got it all under control. Instead, my response was, like Lessing, well, it would be cool if it were sunny, but if it were sunny, it would be easy to forget that trauma is real because everybody would be out laughing and enjoying the world. But when it's raining, we're all aware of the fact that there are days where things aren't the way we had hoped. And you know what? Maybe the fact that it's raining is an invitation to reflect on the idea that, God cries when we cry, and God wishes that this weren't the case. And I don't have any answer. I don't have any way to tell you what it should be or how it should have worked out. All I can say is that this IC is good. I'm glad that you are my student. I'm glad that we can sit here and watch the rain fall, because you know what? Tragedy is still real in this life. Now, does that actually get anywhere? No, it doesn't get us to some answer. But what it did was, in an indirect communicative sort of way, invite this student into the reality of the sharedness of becoming, the frustrations of things not being the way we had hoped. So when Climacus is trolling Jacobi by siding with Lessing, what I think he's doing is basically saying, man, like, you would suck so hard as a friend, right? Like, man, like, no, I'll go hang out with Lessing because Lessing gets that it sucks that it's raining, but probably doesn't try to convince me that everything's great, but says, you know what? But even in the middle of the rain, we're okay, even when things aren't. And that moment is, I think, ultimately what Kierkegaard's authorship is. It's an invitation to go get an icy because it's raining outside and trauma is real. But it doesn't leave us there. I just got an email from that former student this week, actually, telling me about that she had just gotten engaged and how wonderful her life is and how happy she is and how great everything is. And then she said, every time it rains, I now smile because I'm able to recognize that rain isn't something that messes up our plans. It's something that reminds us that maybe the world isn't all according to plan. And you know what? I'll take that. Like, that was one of those like professor wins for me, not in the sense of like, suck it, all the rest of you bad professors, but man, it would have been so easy for me to mess that one up, right? To have in my intellectual prowess answered some sort of thing rather than just letting it be okay that question doesn't get answered today and maybe not ever, So I don't know if that helps to kind of articulate Lessing's ditch, but for me, that idea, and maybe this is the best way to put it, what's so cool about the incarnation as interpreted by Kierkegaard across his authorship, and we'll see this especially in the next 2 weeks, is when God looks down into the ditch of human existence, the goal was not to get us out of it, but to jump down in and remind us that, in fact, we weren't supposed to get out, that it's okay. God's with us here. Emmanuel, the idea of God being with, that maybe that withness is really the core, right? And I should say, that's way more confessional than I tend to get in my own work. So that's why my story is one that isn't about here's then the right answer of the divine. It's about saying, hey, I didn't even ever have to mention God. Just saying, hey, you know what? I'm with you today. Let's you tell me what's going on. Had a student call me this past week about 1 o'clock in the morning, texted me and was suicidal. And, man, what do you do in those moments? Right. And yet in that moment, trying to explain to him, here's this objective reality, that ain't the point. It was immediately getting out of bed and calling that person, saying, you ain't alone. I'm right here, man. What's going on? Right. And that ability to be with in the midst of while acknowledging over 70,000 fathoms, please God help me, because I'm more than likely going to blow this and the consequences are real. That's what faithfulness is. Not holding myself up as an example of faithfulness, but trying to say in my life, these are the moments where I was praying deeply that God help me be faithful, rather than be confident and certain in my abilities to answer the problem, rather than be in it with them.
So we only have a little bit of time left, and there are a couple things people ask for clarification on.
All right.
So what does Kierkegaard mean when he talks about faith means facing the possibility of offense? Is that something that's distinctively Christian in the sense of related to the incarnation, the paradox, or something? Or maybe what's the religious interpretation of the offense? And then how do existentialists outside of the Christian tradition kind of engage?
Understand it? Yeah. So the easy answer is yes. For Kierkegaard, offense is explicitly Christian, but it's an offense because it is something that offends our good taste. Surely God would have better sense than to show up this way, right? It's kind of like, you and I would be probably like the worst people ever to invite to a fancy cocktail party. Like, that's not going to go well. We're both going to show up in beanies, and we're both probably going to have all kinds of inappropriate
or toboggans.
And I may show up with my sled, right? And we do this, and then we do all kinds of inappropriate things, like start talking to people not in small talk, but in robust, deep ways. This is why philosophy majors never get invited to good parties, right? We are bad at them. So what it is that's offensive about Christianity specifically is the people who are at the fancy cocktail party at the church do not want Jesus showing up, because Jesus is going to radically mess up. Remember, God is trouble or God is nothing. God is trouble for the self-aggrandizing complacency of their institutional narrative of their own rightness. God's offensive to that in this person of radical humility, radical lowliness. But in the existential sense, well, what is it that the dominant narrative in our society says? Success is all that matters. Go get a lot of money. Your dignity is defined in economic terms. And what is it the existentialists say? We're all in this together. You are condemned to be free. No matter how much you got, right? Whatever block you're from, you're still of the block when it comes to finitude, right? So again, all these ideas are translatable in non-religious ways. I do think we lose Kierkegaard in the process, but we don't lose the point. And I think that's something really powerful.
Mm-hmm. When Kierkegaard calls the individual's untruth sin, what does he mean? And for those that asked, this is page 210. Well, those that didn't ask, it's on page 210. But anytime a philosopher ventures out with a definition of sin that's not immediately obvious, then I'm sure it's a minister that asks. So especially, mainline Protestants, we don't like to use the word sin. Right. That's why we have a prayer of confession, so we don't have to. So anytime we have a philosopher, we can help unpack it. It kind of those allergic to sin talk because they grew up in a real judgmental environment and we're the recovery zone. It helps.
So the specific discussion of sin here is this idea. We tend to think of original sin as some sort of thing that you are sinful before you born, right? You've already inherited some sort of guilt. Climacus's account is no, sin is the fact of being born as a historical being, because what that now means is you have work to do, because before you're born, ostensibly, you are either non-existent, in which case you can't be sinful, or you are eternal, in which case it doesn't make any sense to be sinful. Because what is sin? Sin is some separation from God. Well, what separates us from the divine? Our limitation, internal to finitude. And this is why the way we overcome sin in this idea is that God, in the paradox of Christ, spans the gap of eternity and finitude and makes possible a contemporaneous relationship with eternity in time. So he calls it hereditary sin because it's the sin that happens at birth, right? It's passed by birth, not passed in some sort of metaphysical sense. It's the fact of being historical. That's why he ends that big paragraph on 210 by saying, he must go forward. To go backward is impossible, right? You got to go forward means you have to do the best you can given where you are and when you are. And that means you have to overcome the sin of being finite. But the goal is not to then stop being finite. Remember Abraham. The goal is to receive finitude as the gift of eternal significance at every instant. And that's possible only by the contemporaneous with Christ, says Climacus and Kierkegaard.
So, part of what it's getting at there, picks up that conversation from earlier about the finite being caught in this, like you can't opt out of a subject-object dichotomy.
Right.
He has some sarcastic asides towards meditation, which are pretty entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
But that you can't, so when you're born, in a sense, sin or untruth is connected to the fact that a finite being only only talks about the truth from the condition of finitude, which includes that subject-object distinction.
Yep.
So that if you're trying to get at truth there, truth becomes an object, which already problematizes it because you're turning the infinite, perfect God of love as a Christian into an object there.
Yes.
It's in some sense, that's like a sexy philosophical way to talk about idolatry, right?
Yeah.
Which is, it's one of the big 10.
Yeah, or you turn yourself into a fiction in order to get around the idolatry. And this is where he tells that awesome joke, which somebody posted on Facebook, where he basically does, eins, zwei, drei, Kochlorum. It's this, by counting to 3 and then saying, hocus pocus, you can somehow now become the numinal I. And Climacus is like, and one of my favorite jokes, I can find it really quick, is where he then says, bottom of 201, only the fantastical I is simultaneously finished with both ways or advances methodically along both ways simultaneously. In other words, you're somehow managing to be this existing person who also understands everything objectively, right? You're somehow pulling off both of these. But, he says, which for an existing human being is such an inhuman way of walking that I dare not recommend it. That's freaking funny, right? Because walking with Kierkegaard is this idea. Why can't you walk this way? Because if you walk this way, you won't just be John Cleese doing the ministry of funny walks. You'll stop being a human. So that's a pretty high cost when it comes to trying to have your truth and eat it too, right? You can't do it. You can't pull it off.
So, okay. So we're running out of time. So there's like 9 topics we didn't get to. So people can let us know. We can pick things up at the beginning of next time, but we need to say something about religiousness A and religiousness B. Otherwise, I just feel like we've done inadequate encounter.
And I apologize to everyone for not including those pages in the reading. The reason I didn't is because
there was already plenty of pages.
There's plenty of pages, and the discussion of religiousness A and B, it's only like a paragraph or so in what's there. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that really is, I think, kind of dry and not one of the more interesting sections. Here's the quickest way I can do that. Religiousness A is an awareness of the single individual being higher than the universal, which we talked about last week. Religiousness B is an awareness that the single individual higher than the universal is standing in a relationship with Jesus Christ as the incarnate God in time. It's the determinacy added to the structure. Religiousness A is a structural awareness. Religiousness B is a specifically Christian way of walking.
So would you say something like, or that religiousness A, because he talks about the immanent nature of it, that it's a kind of religiousness where God is everywhere, ubiquitous in general, and nowhere in particular. So the individual has a kind of spirituality, a religiosity, a God consciousness of sorts, which results then, because of the sin of untruth, right? Like he talks about the pathos of it, of resignation, suffering, guilt, in that it knows of God but can't relate to God, because the conditions for the possibility of faith aren't on the terms of the imminent, ubiquitous, general, everywhere kind of thing. So religiousness B is where the Christian object of faith, the God-man, the incarnation, makes talk of faith meaningful precisely by making it absurd on the imminent, ubiquitous, general religious talk plane. And that's where he has that line where he says that oh man, I remembered it while you were saying it. Something about the absurd is the object of faith and the only object that can be believed, or something like that.
Yeah. So look at the bottom of 2:11, and then we will link that to the top of 2:20. Bottom of 2:11. What then is the absurd? The absurd is that the eternal truth has come into existence in time, that God has come into existence, has been born, has grown up, etc., has come into existence exactly as an individual human being, indistinguishable from any other human being, inasmuch as all immediate recognizable is pre-Socratic paganism, and from the Jewish point of view, idolatry. Now I'll jump over to 2:20, top of the page. The object of faith is therefore the God's actuality in the sense of existence. But to exist signifies first and foremost to be a particular individual. And this is why thinking must disregard existence, because the particular cannot be thought, but only the universal. And by the way, footnote, what he really means here is what I suggested last week is singularity, not particularity, which would be a Hegelian category that is always thought only in light of the universal. But that's that technical thing we distinguished last week. The object of faith, then, is the actuality of the God in existence. That is, as a particular individual, that the God has existed as an individual human being. So what then is Christianity? Not a doctrine about the unity of divine and human, about subject object, about some sort of grand metaphysical story. It is not a doctrine at all, but the fact that God has existed, right? So this idea that ultimately we move from religiousness A in its kind of ubiquitous accessibility, right? Even if we aren't faithful, right? Remember, we couldn't understand Abraham, even though we were trying to make sense of it from Silentio's perspective. Religiousness A, like there's nothing about Abraham that requires him to be Christian, right? It's just this bigger idea of him standing in relation with God, but God here is this sort of broader category of gift. It's bigger than universality as a metaphysical concept. But moving from that Abrahamic model of faith as just this relation that can be articulated as algorithm, subjectivity is higher than universality. Now we end up with me in relation to this individual who is eternality as such. And for what it's worth, and I'm sure people will accuse me of being unfair in this, part of my critique, which has gone on again for about 15 years in print, my critique of Jack Caputo, who I love, is that I think the version of deconstructive faith that he articulates makes religiousness be impossible. And that shift, again, I talk this as a philosopher, not because I want to be a Christian, but as a philosopher, religiousness be seems to me an important possibility even for deconstructionists. But that means that we have determinacy in the articulate content of the faith as a lived praxis.
Mm-hmm. So is that like picking up like when Caputo talks about the event?
Yes.
And then he insists that you know not where it comes from or the content of the one of the source, right? So like the event, we can talk about the form of the event, the rupture and such, but
you can call it. Well, he can say, you know, we can call it Jesus, but we also could call it justice, or we also could call it mercy. Like, so in other words, the fact that it could be all these other things, which I entirely affirm as deconstructionist, I also want to say, but my deconstructionism does not make impossible the ability of standing determinately the way someone like Kierkegaard does. That is an option, and that option would then be not just in Christianity, but any religious articulation that has this incarnate model of God rupturing temporality. That rupture in a discrete moment would be what religiousness be is all about. Now, Christianity is the exemplar of that for Kierkegaard. But again, I think as a philosopher, we've got to recognize even the move from structure to particular is still a structural claim. And that's where it's not limited to a Christian account, but it is the truth of Christianity according to this view. Okay.
I mean, since this is the end, then we said we would get even nerdier towards the end, which I think we have. So this picks up a conversation, which if you're a Homebrewed member, this is somewhere in the Homebrewed member feed where Jack and I get in an argument about Paul Tillich. And it was around this point, right? Like when those that have been reading Paul Tillich as a radical theologian, I'm always like, no, I get how it works for his ontology. But Tillich says, right, like, you know, all language about God's symbolic. You have the ruptures, you have the event. It's about the relationship of the infinite and the finite. He does a lot of similar stuff around subject-object distinction you read in this. Faith, like faith is calling one into a different relationship to all objects because the subject has been put in a different disposition towards themselves, right? Anyway, so Tillich does all this kind of stuff. And Jack, the two things that came up in our discussion about it was one, the source of the event. He wants it to be ethically ambiguous, right? So the call, you experience the call, but you don't know the caller, right? So it's not surprising that his friend Tripp, that's a theologian, is like, well, I don't know. But also so there he kind of like uses, I guess it's Middle Schelling's bit around the kind of the subject, the introduction of subject object distinction then includes kind of good and evil within the ultimate prior to the distinction, right? As a means of talking about the event there. And then the other part was that the event, you can have the structure of an event without ever having the Christ event itself, right? And so Tillich says that in one sense, the new event, the new creation in the Christ event, new being, right, is his term, has to have a specific referent. And he means literally Jesus, like not literally in a fundamentalist way, but like a finite being, right? And that's like, you can see his Kierkegaardianness coming in. But then Tillich wants to expand it past what Kierkegaard's doing and say that the Christ event is for the Christian, right, the definitive model of an event, but it is a model that form of that event can be transposed to any other conditioned thing because Jesus actually reveals and participates in new creation or new being, right? Which, so God could take up any other finite thing or any part of conditioned reality. The unconditioned can do it. So in some sense, the work of the Spirit, if you're Tillich, means anything to become an occasion for the rupture of the unconditioned or the infinite. But what's normative is it having done so in the God-man, or the new being in Christ.
Well, and it's important because the trick here is not to then think stressing the determinacy of religiousness means that you are somehow a fundamentalist exclusivist, right? That would be a slippage. And in fact, if anybody's interested, one of the books that I co-edited here simply called Re-examining Deconstruction and Determinate Religion Toward a Religion with Religion. And the whole idea was maybe it's time not to be with religion without religion like Derrida and Caputo, but religion with religion again, right? The deconstructive religious structures with determinacy of something like religiousness be. How could we pull those off? And so I want to read just one line here, because this is ultimately what I think a responsible religiousness is about as a philosopher. Between the spectral God, in scare quotes, of religion without religion on the one hand, and the scare quotes God called upon to justify a particular vision of usually conservative politics and fundamentalist exclusivism on the other hand, lies a wide middle ground that should be explored not only by theologians and sociologists, but also, and maybe primarily, by philosophers. The middle between skepticism and dogmatism does not have to be mushy compromise, but potentially could present a vigorous and compelling invitation to gracious dialogue. For me, I don't like, part of why I would defend the importance of religiousness as philosopher is because I'm actually a fan of epistemic charity. I don't think it makes any sense to engage somebody from a different religious tradition without taking seriously the fact that we're going to disagree about some stuff, and that's the condition of our talking. We can only walk with by recognizing that we're not the same person walking. And so my worry about religiousness is that what it can do is be a sort of a slightly less offensive version of, a kind of Ronerian anonymous Christian, or a kind of John Hickeyan radical pluralism. Hey, it's all just going the same way anyway, kind of stuff. And my very good friend Jay McDaniel, another process guy, used to tell me all the time that I didn't have a robust enough sense of complementary truth. And I used to say, Jay, no, I want complementary truths. I just don't think you have a robust enough sense of the fact that sometimes truths are incompatible, right? Like, we have to take seriously the idea that we might really disagree with someone, and the difference in that disagreement doesn't then necessarily yield some sort of radical exclusivist soteriology, but it might yield an exclusivism at the level of truth claims. Namely, our risk is moving in different directions. And we only walk together by recognizing that ultimately what unites us is the riskiness of the walk, not the directionality in which we walk. And that move is, for me, what I call religion with religion, right? Along with my co-authors in the book, there's a kind of group of us. And we were trying to say, hey, we're with Jack on deconstruction. We just think that to be an honest deconstructionist, you've genuinely got to then be invested in standing somewhere. Yeah. Jack's response, which is entirely reasonable as well, is he accuses me of settling for an abridged version of postmodernity. It's the postmodernism that lets you, as he puts it at one point, go back to your Pentecostal worship meetings without being troubled. And my response was, no, where else would I be more troubled than in my Pentecostal meetings, recognizing how quickly it can become the very elitist self-sufficiency narrative of idolatry that deconstructive postmodernism, existentialism warn us against. So I am most haunted when I am at church. because that is the moment where I am the least able to rest comfortably in what's going on. Right. But it's because that I hope, trying to become a Christian that church is so hard for me. That intersection is one that I think, to be honest, that Jack and I finally kind of understood that we were really close to each other. But it was when he heard that I had struggled with being kicked out of churches, then he was like, so you're one of the people like me. Like, yeah, I've been telling you this for years. Kierkegaard does not make going to church easy. Tillich does not make going to church easy. But what Kierkegaard and Tillich, the way I think you and I read them, do is still encourage us to show up at church. Because it's only by showing up that the attack on Christendom can really be launched.
Awesome. All right. We've gone over. So
sorry, everybody.
No,
I hope this was a better balance. We did some more.
Pause.
Well, we did some general stuff.
Later.
Then we got in the weeds here in the last 20 minutes. So yeah, feel free to stop the last 20 minutes if you don't want to mess with that. Of course, I guess if they're
listening to you say this,
then that would make no sense, would it? Well, but if they understand backwards, now having lived forwards, they can now go back and realize where they should have stopped.
Excellent. That's good. That's good. Just maybe that you were using the skip button.
That's right. That's right. Next week is Works of Love, which is way, way, way more fun than any of this stuff, because it is definitely not as philosophically robust in terms of like knowing the Hegel and the background and the Lessing and all this. But it is going to be where most scholars, I actually have a different view than this, but most scholars think this is where we finally get a real vision of Kierkegaardian ethics. Because now it's an ethics internal to the love command affirmed in religiousness B. As somebody becoming a Christian, now I can take myself up as commanded to love my neighbor as myself. So that's what we're going to think through next week. All righty. Well, we'll see you then. And if you are in the UK like me, it's getting late. And take care, everybody. All right. Bye. See you, everybody. Cool, man. I think that was all right. We did a little technical move there at the end, but otherwise kept it a little more accessible. So, it was fun. It was fun. Yeah, bro. Fun stuff. Well, I will go to bed. I will soon plan. I'll talk to you in my dream. I'll tell you all the things I didn't say. Unless a piano falls on our head, I'll plan to see you next Tuesday, man.